Start, Toby.
Toby Rickball, Marathon Petroleum.
Nevis BJ, Heartland Environment.
Nancy King, I'm with IDEM on the board council.
Jason Lenz, I'm the chair and I represent the environmental interests on this board.
Kim Logan.
Assistant Commissioner, IDEM, Office of Land Quality, representing the Commissioner.
And let's see, we have three guests, I think, that I'd like to introduce, or at least three guests that told me they would be here today. Representative Sue.
Hi, Jason. It's Mark Aldous is here, and I represent the insurance industry.
Thanks, Mark. I didn't mean to leave you out there.
Jim. So Manning told you the same thing he told me in the afternoon.
Who's that? Okay. So Representative Sue Arrington, she's here today. Welcome. Thank you. From the 34th district. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Representative Maureen Bauer. And Representative Pat Boyd. She represents District 9, Michigan City, is that correct? Well, thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for the invitation. Mr. Pete, the three of us are members of the Environmental Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives.
Okay, great. Spot here. Okay. Update on agency activities.
Alrighty. Jason asked me sort of reminder of what the functions of the financial assurance plan are and the purpose of what the board does as it relates to the agency. For those of you who like to dig around in the Indiana code, the code that speaks to the duties of the board can be found at IC 13-23-11-7. The primary function for the Financial Assurance Board from a regulatory perspective is establishing and passing the rules that deal with the standards for the ELF claims, for basically how we run ELF claims and how reimbursement occurs. Meeting about, we are engaged in redrafting the rules, starting another rulemaking. I should tell you, this kind of jumps into my next segue here of where we are statutorily and with the session. Our draft rule right now is over at the Office of Management and Budget during the legislative session, as happens pretty much every year. All the rulemaking that they have to review before it can start the public process takes sort of a backseat to all of the work they have to do for fiscal impact analysis for the various statutes and or the various bills that are out there. So we, along with a lot of the other agencies, are waiting to get that out of the Office of Management and Budget, at which point we'd be able to start the rulemaking process, the formal rulemaking process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But basically, what the purpose of the Financial Assurance Board is, they are to work with the agency, and as you'll see in a few minutes, we'll have the reports on where the fund is, what is going on with the fund, what the reimbursements are for the fund, and have those kinds of discussions. We have a broad array of board members who represent various aspects that have been related to the board. When this board was first created many, many years ago, when the funds that were in the board, in the fund itself were based on tank fees, this board was much larger. It was reduced to 9 members when that changed, when the funding for the program became a tax on gas fund. This happened many years ago when the fund was nearly insolvent, and we were very close at that time. And so that's when there was a push through the legislative session to turn that into a gas tax to fund the excess liability trust fund. So those are really, you know, that's how this has changed over the years in terms of what this originally started out as and where we are now, and why the board itself has gotten smaller. And so the representation has not changed. We've just removed a few of the board members that were on here. But so the board, each meeting is required to take testimony and receive the written report from the agency on the administrative expenses that the department is claiming from the fund. That's also limited to a certain percentage under Indiana Code, under Title 13. Also, information on the claims that we have paid out. That usually the table that you'll see and is in the board packet includes additional times that folks are able to resubmit for claims. Something might be denied for lack of information. There are a number of reasons why. Much of that is also within the rule itself. Again, the board adopts the rules that we hope we'll be getting out of OMB very quickly or soon here. I mean, we're not quite done with the session yet, but pretty much at the end of the session is usually when those things kind of break again. This board is to consult with the department on the administration of the fund. The department itself is the administrator of the fund, but it is in conjunction with working with the board. So that's essentially what this board does. I don't know if there's something else pertaining to that you kind of need to talk about, Jason.
Well, when I get a phone call from someone that's complaining about they didn't get their claim, we're not administering those funds.
Right,
We don't have
right.
any,
Right, that's when you say you should call IDEM and complain to them.
and that's usually what I do. So we don't have any control over the rates. We don't have any control over when you're going to get reimbursed. That's not the function of this board. We're here to adopt rules when the rules are right.
Right.
And to provide some oversight, some direction on the overall funds.
Right, and honestly, I mean, it's actually through the rulemaking, and how we have structured the rule and the discussions we've had. And in the past, we have had some pretty lengthy work groups, with all interested parties that have helped shape those rules. That's the work group process is not a statutory process, but it's one that we have engaged in at IDEM for many years with our rulemakings, because there are so many interested parties depending on whatever the rule is. So those have been very beneficial in shaping how the rules have changed over the years. So to the extent that this board adopts those rules, you do have a say in the reimbursement and how it works in terms of the number of times that people can resubmit, things like that. There's a statutory construct to all of this. The rules themselves really are the guideline or the so you know, that's part of that statutory concept of communicating with the board, and having people with the various expertise that our board members have is beneficial in making those a broad conversation as to how everything relates. So it's not just about processing a claim. It's a larger picture than that.
And in fact, and one of the upcoming legislations that we'll talk about here, I mean, I think there's even language in there that says the board must adopt once this passes. Is that correct?
Which bill are you talking about?
246.
The most recent version of that I've seen, that was the language that was in there. At this point in time, I am not sure where that particular bill is, as it's moved over. I've not seen that it's gotten a hearing as yet. So I don't know what the current actual status of that particular bill is. The one bill that I just wanted to mention briefly in terms of the updates that we had was the one that pertains to rulemaking. And that's, 1226, am I right? Yeah, 1326. That bill is a very major component to our process as well as every other agency in the state, because it deals with rulemaking for all administrative agencies within the state. And it has been, there was a summer study committee, and what came out of that is a pretty major change to how rulemaking is being suggested. I know that our agency has some issues with that. We have a separate rulemaking process that's in 13-14-9 of the code. Most of the other agencies deal in Title IV, it's 422. We sort of dip in and out of that, but we've always had our own sort of process. Our process is a bit longer. However, some of the concepts that are now being considered for other agencies are some of the things that we do with the first notice, second notice. It's a bit more robust. There's a lot of conversation right now with that bill. And one of the things that the board will be looking at to adopt here in the future is what ultimately comes out of that bill. So that's kind of another reason that we're, I think that OMB might be holding a lot of rules right now, besides just the amount of work they have to do for the session, especially it being a budget session. But that look may be quite different by the time that gets adopted. So it continues to go through changes or discussions about changes pretty much daily from what I'm understanding. So that really is something that's going to impact most of the administrative agencies state, depending on what that ends up looking like. I have heard that they're also talking about continuing that study committee. Even if they do, a lot of these changes will be codified in the interim. How that's going to look, I really don't know at this point, but that will impact our rulemaking process as well.
So for example, if and when SB 246 passes and gets in front of us, by the way that it was written, we're obligated to accept it and pass it here at this board. I guess I just want to make sure that everybody's aware of that.
Right, and it will, the procedural stuff that they're talking about in the bill that I'm referring to doesn't have anything to do with an alternate statutory authority that says an agency shall do this or that, or a board shall adopt this or that. They can't by procedure tell you, like, intervene in another bill necessarily to do that. So, yeah, that is true. That would, depending on what that looks like, it would be, the process to adopt that would be under this new process, whatever that ends up being at this time. And so we're kind of in a wait and see mode to see where that is ending up.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I did fail to mention, we do have a forum with two of us online and 6 of us here, and we're required to have 5. So next, the fund administrators report.
So get ready here. Yep, great. So I'm Doug Fox, the Deputy Assistant Commissioner. First, I'd like to apologize for this not being in the agenda we sent out. We've got a lot in the agency, and our accounting department is not excluded from that. So it took them a little bit more time to get it to us than usual. If Carla hasn't updated it on the website yet, we'll get it updated with these additional slides in there. And I think you guys, what we sent to you was the spreadsheet that has fiscal years 19, all of that stuff. Normally what we'll do is we cut it down to just the current fiscal year and then the other thing, but you've seen the other stuff, it's just duplicative of that. So as it stands right now, we still have. Yeah. You don't want to read that, sorry, somebody that's in the audience.
Well, the big number at the bottom says 166.
Yeah, that one, I think, was one of the total available budget.
Appropriations is 37 billion.
Yeah, 37 million and then minus the one, so 36 million and some change. Our expenses are listed there for personal services and external services, bringing us down to a budget balance of about 28 million, 26 million.
28, sorry, 27.
Yeah. And that's where we stand right now. Then at the very bottom, as Jason pointed out, we're at 166 million, and a little bit of change as far as ending balance. This is as of the end of February. I can't see any of that stuff. For everybody that can't see this, which is everybody, unless you're online, just go and find it. It's on the website. You'll be able to see all this stuff, and find it there. So my apologies for that. Like I said, we were a little cramped for time trying to get this put together. We didn't get it the normal allotment of time that we normally have. Here's our incidents updated. So far, we are at 95 total incidents reported, from July to the end of February. 60 of those have been confirmed, 35 suspected. This is a little bit slow, but not much. So it looks like we'd be averaging about 100 plus incidents for the year. We normally see about 120 to 150. And it does tend to fluctuate from year to year, just depending on circumstances. So as of the end of February again, so we've received almost 6 million requested. We've approved 3.7 so far, and we have reimbursed 3.2. Our average view time is 69 days, so it's going down. We've kind of ticked up a little bit over the last couple of months as we brought on new people. Every time we bring on someone new, we have to pull a reviewer and train them up. But we are more or less fully staffed right now, and we have one person coming off training. So we've seen a decline in our backlog of claims. So yes, I should continue to speed up.
Business days.
Was that?
that business
No, that's total days. So this is just the question I get asked a lot, and this is still just kind of an update. But what are our most common denials? So I think as far as frequency goes, the number of them, by far the most we see is the reduced reimbursement to task. What that means is the rule defines what your rate is based on the task you do, not based on your title. So if a senior project manager is doing tech level work, they don't get to bill a senior project manager rate. We knock them down to a technician rate. So monetarily may not be the highest that we see in reduction, but that's definitely the most common. The reasonable and cost effective one is also still a very common one. I just want to remind everybody, we still have that NPD lump sum for certain costs. I still encourage people to utilize that as much as they can for expedited reimbursement. Over budget without a change order. This is usually a denial at first. We've been able to work most of these out. It just takes a little bit more time. So if you are working with a pre-approval, just remember to work with our pre-approval folks, get any change orders done, or at least provide us that additional information. Normally, what we've been seeing on a lot of these is related to the last one too, which is a lack of backup. And I know I talked to you about one after the last meeting, and Jason had another one for another client. We were able to get that resolved pretty quickly once we got, I think you had sent me an email that was sent around. So once we got all of that packed in there, we were able to address that. So we still see a lack of backup on occasion that does result in those amounts. Yep.
I know the approval rate versus the amount reviewed is still less than 70%, which that's still to me way too low. And we're dealing with the same set of consultants, right? For the most part, in the same item. Is there a way that these two can get together and get on the same page? Because it's really the tank owners who's paying the difference. Because that's way too 30% is a big, what they think they're doing is right. Item says it's not right. Where is that disconnect in this 30%? I mean, I know the tweets, there's a few here and there, but that's a big percentage.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't disagree. And some of the changes that we are going to be implementing or have started implementing as of today, or within this past week. So when we see right, so instead of denying some of those costs outright, like we have been, we've been working with our legal counsel and formulating a plan to implement the NPD lump sum rate. So that number should go up. So instead of denying, so say the NPD rate's $2,000, a consultant submits 3,000. Instead of denying all 3,000 and asking for a reasonable and cost-effective, determination, we'll pay 2,000, or they can come back in for the 1,000 and do that. So that's one of the ways that we're gonna be implementing to, again, like what you're saying. It's better for us not to deny it outright if we have that NPD there. So we're gonna be utilizing that, and then whatever's the overage, then we'll discuss that. So I think that'll help. Also with the pre-approvals, we are working with our claims folks, again, with our legal counsel, and our pre-approval folks to streamline the payment process on those, as well as streamlining the process for submitting and getting pre-approvals. It was bound to happen. I think I've been pretty honest about that. It was a new process. It's time to take a look at that again, and see if we can try to hone some of that and get these going faster, get them more accurate. And then on the claim side, making sure that we're getting these through in an appropriate and fast fashion. And I think between those two things, I think that we're gonna see that number should go up. And like I said, it's the pre-approval soon for us and it's good for consultants. So I get it. There's gonna be a little bit of, kind of waxing and waning between the two of us because we're both trying to learn this at the same time. So it's not in an ideal state where I want it to be right now. But we're gonna try to make some incremental change to get us there. And that's, definitely something that we're working on.
The argument I've heard against trying to get pre-approval is that it's a long drawn out process. From personal experience, I know that to be the case as well. And there's so much back and forth. And that time can't be accounted for. It's not fair to the client.
Right.
Can't put it on claim. And it wasn't faster to get reimbursed. And then at times, the pre-approved rate wasn't, it was knocked down.
Right, yeah, and I agree. Like I said, those are things we need to look at. Those are things we're looking at now to try and make that go faster. It shouldn't take longer to do the pre-approval process, the whole point.
And wouldn't you agree that if you and I, or whoever from my office and from your office, agree that, hey, these tasks need to be done, you're gonna get 10 grand. And we found ways to get the work done. And maybe bill 1 less hour or 2 less hours, that you should still pay the 10 grand.
And we're moving more towards that. That's definitely what we're doing. Now, there will be some where we're gonna have some questions. So say you put in 2 hours for, I don't know, project manager or something like that. And even if you're on budget, you spend 20 hours for that project manager on that. That would be one where we probably want to ask some questions. Not saying it wouldn't be reimbursed, but that would be something that would jump out of the page. We would want to take a look at that and have that discussion. But yes, moving more or less to what you're discussing is what we've been talking about this week. And trying to get that through internally and develop some new processes to make that work better.
Yeah, I'm just in agreement with you that within the industry here, I think the pre-approval process these problems have been deterrents for tank owners to utilize that process.
I agree. And this is the discussion that Tim and I were having earlier or late last week. We shouldn't be discouraging these. We want to encourage these. So what are things that we can and should be doing internally as an agency to encourage more and more pre-approvals as the process goes on? We definitely should not be discouraging the use of that. And some of how it's been, how we've been implementing it so far has served to be kind of a deterrent. I agree.
And then, I don't want to keep drawing this out, so I'm sorry, but well, it's fresh in my mind. One of Tom's questions about total denial for something, and now, you're gonna pay a portion of it based upon the lump sum reimbursement. Is that because if you go through the appeal process, that's what typically they would do anyways?
Not necessarily. When you go through the appeal process, that's gonna be a whole different thing. They're gonna look at the denial as it is and all. It just depends on the structure of what's being appealed and how it's appealed, and what the actual questions are. I'm not sure, and that's probably more of a Nancy question, what, OEA case progeny actually has to say about whether they're dictating a specific cost or not. I think I've seen both. So I think it's just gonna depend on the circumstances and what that appeal looks like.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think that's great that if you're doing that, because what we found out, right or wrong or indifferent, the appeal process is quicker. You're gonna get the majority of it back for the client. And so, you know, we have encouraged people at times, just probably more work for the agency than just doing a resubmittal and dealing with the reviewer.
Yeah, it can be, for us, but it just, like I said, it's dependent.
And when I found out going through the appeal process, it's the consultant didn't provide the right information, IDEM didn't ask the right questions. So when you finally get the right questions, the answer was there and it was paid. That's what I'm talking about, getting on the same page to begin with, because we spend a lot of time with the appeal process, it takes up lawyers, judges, all that stuff. And it's just because there wasn't good communication. It was all good, but, and we're not on the same page.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree.
And you've implemented that process, you said that process is happening today, you implemented
And
it today.
we've got, so like I said, we had to discuss it with our legal counsel, and we did get, final say on that yesterday. So it may take a little bit for that to kind of get into a broad section-wide email for the claims reviewers, but yes. So, I did send that out saying we're going to implement that as soon as we possibly can.
But it's not today. But it's-
I don't know, I'd have to ask Katie if she said.
All right.
So we were here. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the ELF audit results, and you guys wanted a little bit of additional time to discuss that, or review that. These are just some of the basics. So the actuarial forecast out to one. You kind of have to have just a date where you stop collecting data, otherwise we'll never get it done. So that we picked. The forecasts go through fiscal year 2032. It was performed by some of the people that did the last one. Managerial audit was performed by RNA and risk professionals, who also performed managerial audit last time. So I know that there were some questions about the estimated liability for current sites and future sites and why that number is so high. Yes, I believe it's inflated. Be very risk averse and conservative in their estimation. That's part one. The other part is they're assuming that all releases are eligible. And the reason why they do that is because we can't necessarily compute that everyone's eligible. We still have it happen where a 1989 release comes in, they get an NFA, and then they submit all of their costs from 1989 until today, all at once. When they get that NFA, that still happens. They still do that under statute removal. Sorry about that. And they are still allowed to do that. Now, anecdotally, does that happen very often? No. No, but they're assuming that, and there's a portion of the rule that we haven't been able to implement in 329. It's 329-9-821 that basically states that within 30 days of reporting a release, you're required to submit your proof of financial responsibility to the agency. Because of issues we had issuing COPAs for years and years and years, we haven't been able to implement that yet because not everybody has a valid COPA still. We're better, we're probably close to 70%, but we need to get much more close to that 100. And once we do that, then I'll be able to tell exactly how many people are going to be relying on that upfront release.
Yeah, but I mean, even with that, it takes $477 million, we're paying up $401,000 a month, that's almost 99 years worth of monthly payouts. I mean, that is a,
It's like,
especially with the funds growing $36 million a year.
Right.
I mean, it's a,
and I agree. And they're also, one of the other things that they're looking at is they're looking at all of our sites. So they're using estimations that also involve some of these really old ones, right? That are millions and millions of dollars. And, you know, what we've seen over the last 5 years is those costs going down on, individualized releases. So it's going to pump up that number a little bit still. but yeah, those are some of the reasons why it is that way. So they do continue to estimate their future liability, will decrease through fiscal year 32, which I think is true. That assumption is based on a number of things, including, better compliance, newer equipment and things of that sort. So, go ahead.
When does the financial responsibility for ELF end? There's not a cutoff date, is what you're saying.
Correct.
So, it would have to be issued an NFA or let's say an ERC, right, for that incident number, financial responsibility to end.
I'm sorry, I think maybe I misunderstood your question. So, our obligation to offer that as financial responsibility for people. So previous to, so releases reported prior to July 1, 2016, the only requirement for submittal that we have in the rule is that all costs need to be submitted within 12 months of that no further action. Is it 12 months or 9 months? 12 months of no further action, right? So they don't have to submit the eligibility determination until that point in time. So those are the ones that we don't know. And it's the same, we have the same issue when we report to EPA, because they ask us, well, what are these other people using? And we're like, we don't know. Then they could be using insurance. Maybe they're using some other kind of mechanism. I don't know. Maybe they're paying out of pocket or self-insured. These are questions we don't necessarily have an answer for. And some of them do ultimately come in, right? When you get the NFA, and that's for eligibility at that point. So unless there's another factor that would disqualify them from eligibility, like non-payment of fees, or they didn't report the release time or something like that, they could be eligible 30 years after they reported the release.
But once closure is granted,
Once closure is granted, then the
NFA,
cost.
ERC, either one. Is there any other examples?
Well, so that one would just be NFA. ERC doesn't start a clock.
Well, I'm just talking about when the financial
Yeah.
responsibility ends. So if you issue an ERC that gets accepted, signed off on, put on the deed, the ELF no longer has the responsibility to pay for an incident number.
Unless in accordance with the NFA, there's a reason to reopen that. So if unforeseen circumstances happen, it's happened once or twice in my time in program, but it has happened. So the example I give was we closed the site. At the point in time that we closed it, neither us nor that consultant knew that there was, nor anyone else for that matter, Civil War era tile laid around where the site was. And when they were out doing general construction, fixing their building, maybe putting in some new tanks, it jarred that pocket loose and it got into that tile and caused a mini release that way. We reopened that release, started reimbursing from the ELF, and then issued that NFA once the issue was resolved again and the tile was removed.
Understand?
So it projects a negative equity balance. What does it mean? So an equity balance basically means when they're pointing to that negative at the end of fiscal year 2032, it means that the ELF stopped generating any revenue whatsoever. We wouldn't be able to pay for what their forecasted liabilities are. So that really only comes into play as if somebody's going to talk about sunsetting the fund. I don't think anybody's talking about that at all. I don't think that's on the table. I don't think anybody has an interest in that. So as long as we're still generating revenue and we're still decreasing the cost, that equity balance is going to continue to, it'll get smaller. And so we eventually get there. So equity balance versus actual balance, just kind of highlighting the difference between what a negative equity balance is. Like I said, versus the 2016 audit, which projected insolvency at the end of 10 years. That was not a negative equity balance. That was projecting that we would not be able to report our debts at the end of the 10-year period in the worst case scenario. Or in the adverse case, I should say. Equity balance does continue to decrease year on year. I anticipate that's going to continue, and then hopefully in 5 years, when the next actuarial audit comes, we'll have a negative equity balance anymore. The managerial findings. So claims staff were detailed and accurate in their reviews. Resubmittal claims are common. So again, they highlighted that. That's something that we're going to continue to work on. This highlights your point, Tom, that we need to reduce those as well. There's some variability for reimbursement of certain tasks between the claims staff. We try as hard as we can to prevent that from happening, but at the end of the day, people about that weekly with them to try and bring everybody a little bit closer together so that we can stop that variability as much as possible. They also highlight consistent use of risk-based corrective action standards. Us utilizing them since 2016, they highlight. ERCs taken into consideration when establishing corrective action. So that's not saying we're gonna put an ERC on as soon as the release is reported. It's more about utilizing that as a form of your management, and investigation of the release. And taking that into account a little bit sooner in the process, I think will help save some time as well, both for, owners, operators, consultants, and client. As we think about these a little bit earlier in the process.
What did you mean by that? Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so like looking at ERCs and start discussing this a little bit sooner in the process as we're working through, the corrective action on site, right? So as we're working through investigation, as we're looking at these things, starting to look at the ERC and, start looking at terms, start discussing it, if there's offsite ERCs that may be necessary and things of that sort, getting the ball rolling a little bit sooner on our end. That way, because it kind of seems like at the end, we're like, okay, well, now we gotta get an ERC, and there's like a waiting period where, we're just waiting on the ERC to be finalized or for us to review it. So if we're doing that a little bit sooner in the process, we should be able to maybe shave a couple of months, or some time off the back end of the project.
In ERC, just to lower the cost, is that? ERC versus an NFA. Why an ERC versus an NFA?
Well, if we don't need an ERC to issue an NFA, I won't ask for one. We can utilize lines of evidence, and the risk-based guidance allows for use of lines of evidence to, as a mechanism for issuing an NFA. But an ERC otherwise is required as a future use to control, residual contamination. So that's why they're necessary. It's the statutory provision.
But if you continue to clean it up, could you clean up an ERC more to do an NFA? I'm asking why shut off an ERC instead of spending more money to clean it up to an NFA?
Because that's all that's necessary. If the contamination left on site is not causing a risk of exposure to human health and the environment, risk-based corrective action dictates that controlling it is what's necessary. Is all that is necessary.
So an ERC, I guess, to help answer Tom's question, the way I understand it, is significant part of risk-based corrective action. It's a significant part of the way item does business today and is deemed corrective action.
Yes, it is a remedy, if you will. It is a passive remedy. So corrective action, small c, small a corrective action just refers to from the date you report a release until the date it's NFA. That whole thing is corrective action. It's a rigorous term of art, and that's what that means. It doesn't necessarily mean active remediation. It doesn't necessarily mean passive remediation. It means investigation, release, reporting, all of that from soup to nuts.
Doug, I think there's confusion as to, they may be thinking that an ERC is one kind of closure, and FA is another kind. So you need to tie what's an ERC fit into.
Correct. An ERC is a condition for an NFA. There are multiple ways to achievement of further action based on risk-based guidance. You can utilize control of the residual contamination as one method. You can also, again, use lines of evidence, right? So if you can show that the terms of the ERC aren't necessary to control the contamination or control exposure to that contamination, that's something the agency will review. And if we agree, we can potentially issue an NFA via lines of evidence versus via an ERC. But it's that control mechanism, right? The passive remedy that we're utilizing to issue the NFA, if that makes sense.
I'm not a tank owner, so I can't really speak for this, but if I was a tank owner, I would look at the ERC and say, it's a deed restriction. Some mechanism of a deed restriction, and I would have to think long and hard about accepting that.
Yeah, and having a property listed as commercial property is also a form of deed restriction as well. I mean, so yes, it is. But the common things I hear are that it stains title, and other things of that sort. I'm yet to hear data on that or see any data that reduces property value or stains title. What clouds your title is it's a gas station. That's going to trigger a phase 2 all day, right? And as far as, you know, some of the other issues, surrounding that, I think, most of the time, financial people are looking for the NFA. They want to see that NFA, they want to know that the agency is done here, and that there's no further potential liability going into the future as far as their lending is concerned, and things of that sort. So,
Doug, can you address prior to the use of ERCs, how sites were closed?
so prior to use of ERCs, before the agency really used risk-based corrective action, was the UST branding management guide. Tim's probably a better person to describe how that used to work. We still could use lines of evidence under risk of the sea. But prior to utilization of that, it was full, you know, removal based on the site parameters. So if the site was listed as commercial, it was taking it down.
So the trade-off is you can leave some contamination in place by having an ERC, which is an environmental restrictive covenant on the deed, on the property, as opposed to having to spend more money or do additional physical remediation and cleanup. So it's one or the other, or sometimes it's.
So this is my issue.
Well, yeah, I mean, it does come down to money, it comes down to time, it comes down to resources, it comes down to all of that, and necessity.
It also comes down to land use, and there's an aspect of a bill that's being, that Chris is actually gonna talk about a little bit later here today, 246, that gets to that point. If you are remediating a gas station, and that land is gonna remain a gas station, then you shouldn't have to clean it up beyond what is necessary for a gas station cleanup. However, if there is a proposed change in use of that land, then and again, this bill kind of addresses that. There's a possibility that the elk could be reopened in certain circumstances to further clean that up. It's a choice of what the land use is going to be, and the cleanup, and what the agency looks at is the use of the land, which determines the extent of the cleanup and what's necessary, and making sure that it's not going off site, it's not creating additional problems. So all of that goes into it. So yes, that is what an ERC is. If it's a gas station, it's going to remain a gas station. We're not going to make you clean up to residential.
And the current draft of the rule also, this is the thing that we talked about too. So future use disposal. If we do leave contamination in place and you go out 10 years later and it's still there, to replace a tank or a piping line or something like that, and you encounter the contamination, having the elk reimbursed for the disposal costs related to the contaminated soil that's there. So that's something that we have as well.
So, okay, I get that, that makes sense. But what happens if you ERC and you're gonna dig up the tank? You wanna replace the tanks?
Mhm.
All of a sudden now, all that dirt you gotta haul away, no longer covered.
That's what I'm saying. So in the current draft form of the rule, I would have that covered.
Okay.
The disposal of that would be covered.
That's
Yes,
a much,
yeah. And also,
What the elk should do.
yeah.
and also,
If we open the ERC under those circumstances, that would be a big deal.
yeah, so, I can't remember exactly how we had worded that, but when the draft language comes out, that's definitely something that we'll have to talk about, whether or not the wording of that is something that works for us. But yes, that's definitely something, I mean, that's been, and I think is the consultant have been asking me about since I started, and I've always agreed, but that's just not how the rule structured. So now we're taking that opportunity to do that. That makes sense to pay for the disposal costs.
And so you're saying SB 246 addresses that?
No, SPD is a different thing. So SPD 246, which Chris is going to talk about, that's.
Because it only addresses if it's not going to be used as a
That would include,
underground storage tank facility.
Yes. and that would include, I think it would include additional costs versus what we're talking about is futures, not necessarily paying for the move, not necessarily paying participation, but paying to make sure that all that gets disposed of, right?
Right.
Defraying some of those future costs related to
Right.
information. And I think what's the 246 is a little bigger and broader, when it encompasses a little bit different and more costs. That makes sense.
I think that'd be a good change.
Yeah,
Just to kind of piggyback on that, I think the thought that an ERC is not a quote unquote stain on the property, that it is in some fashion. We deal with developers all the time and not necessarily lending institutions. You're right, lending institutions care more about an NFA, but ERCs are without question an impediment to property transactions and redevelopment. It's kind of a period there. So we deal with this every day in my realm, so it's, and the thought that an ERC is not a stain on a property, I'm not saying it's the end of the world, but it absolutely is meaningful and impacts daily transactions negatively, and I'm sure Chris can speak to that as well. It is something that the agency shouldn't just kind of gloss over.
No, definitely not. And I try to avoid using it as much as I possibly. There's a way for me to get around putting an ERC on a property, I will, but I need to have some more of that information. And what, part of what I was discussing with you, I think would help some of that, right? And allowing and knowing that there is potential for some of these future expenditures to be covered by the fund post NFA, I think will help go a long way to assuage some of those fears
I
that
agree with that.
so more of the managerial findings. So some of what they found, assignment of rights greatly increases the cost of corrective action. So claim costs, claim costs increased by more than 400% when the consultant was the claimant versus when the RP or the owner operator was the claimant. Our average cost of closure is down to 300,000. We're still the fourth highest in the country. That's not where we want to be, but they're still on a downward trajectory, which is a positive thing. And our average cost for site investigation alone exceeds the average cost for all corrective action in surrounding states. So the average cost to complete for cost of closure and surrounding states, we're beating that just investigators. So these are things that, hopefully as we talk more, as the new rule comes out, these are things that we're going to be able to utilize to cut down the time that sites are open, as well as, keeping these costs, reasonable down the road. Recommendations, these are what they recommended. This is not necessarily what I'm recommending. They recommended that we require pre-approval for all phases of this work. The difference between that and what's happening right now is we're not necessarily pre-approving a phase, right? We're not pre-approving an investigation. Sometimes we're pre-approving quarterly monitoring or something like that, but looking at this more in chunks, larger chunks is kind of what they're suggesting. Require competitive bidding. We have some things that do require competitive bidding, but they're looking at more overarching and overall encompassing based on the phase of work. Utilize task-based costs instead of line-based, and they've been pretty open that that's the way we structured the rule. That's the way that we're proposing to move. Eliminate or limit assignment of rights, and then reduce the ELF reimbursement cap. The last one, I'm not sure that has, they always suggest that because we're the only ones, we pay more than our cap is higher than any other place in the country. But at the end of the day, it's between the owners and operators, their consultant and the state, make sure we don't hit that cap. So because it's there, kind of seems like an artificial ceiling to me. If we're doing the right things and we're doing things well, whether or not it's 2 million or 2.5 million, I don't think is a huge, has a huge impact on the overall cost of remediating sites. So I could hear arguments on both sides of that. That's just kind of my. All right, and that's the end of it for me. Any other questions?
I have a few, but I'll start out with a couple. I'm all for getting rid of the assignment of rights.
Yeah, you and I talked about this.
And I don't think anybody up here probably would oppose, maybe Tom, I don't know, but I think your argument would be with those two guys in the front row. But I'm all for that. Not been an issue now because we hardly have any, and won't do another one. And it hasn't impacted our business at all, so, but do you know, the lowest reimbursement ceiling in the country? Is it still 900,000 in Nebraska?
Well, so I don't know the lowest. I know that in order to be considered a state fund approved by the EPA, meaning that Tom and owners and operators can use it as an FR
Has to be a
mechanism,
million.
has to be at least $1 million. That is required for it to be a state approved fund. There are some that are $1 million, some that are 1.5. I think probably 10 that are around that 2 million mark, 8 to 10. but, I think the lowest is probably, is gonna be around that one. right
And
now.
there's 25 states have an active fund, is that correct?
It's higher than that now. I think we're closer to 30. A couple have come back online in the last couple of years, like Michigan and.
But is there 37 states have their own programs that just don't have active funds? Solvent funds?
I'd have to look at that again. You mean,
it's
meaning
37.
has state program? That I'm not positive, but I'd have to check EPA's website on that.
Yeah, and I think Nebraska is the lowest at 900,000. Now whether, you know, they have that tag as being approved, I don't know. But at least that used to be the case. But I would be all for that. And you can speak to this a whole lot better than I can, but let's say we went back to 2016. I'm assuming your $300,000 number and fourth highest. Is that based on every site from 1992, 1993, or is that based upon the 13 or so random sites that the audit looked at?
No, so that is based on all the sites that were closed in that time period.
So we're using,
Or in the 12-month period. So that cost of closure is a lagging indicator, right? So it's gonna take into, if you have a 1989 release that's closed in 2022 in that year,
so
that
it
cost.
goes, it goes all the way back, basically what you're saying.
Yeah,
It's an average of
It is.
basically every site, all the way back to whenever the study was complete. So if you would go back to, let's say, 2016, what do you think that number would be today?
Oh, me,
Yes,
okay,
if
yeah,
you
yeah,
look
so
at only
taking out
incident
that
numbers.
basis of it, yeah, it's closer to 250 to 275.
Really, that?
Yeah,
No, I mean, if you'd go back to 2016 and just take an incident number that someone got in 2016.
yeah, that's, we're talking the same thing. Yeah, so I think when I initially looked at that, I can't remember if I did a 6 or an 8-year snapshot. So I think it was any release reported and closed within an 8-year period. So went back to like maybe 2014. And that number was right around 275, somewhere in there.
I still think I would have thought that number would be a lot smaller. But I didn't go back and look at every file, so.
Right.
I did go back and look at every random file that, was discussed in the audit, so, which I'll talk about some of those in a minute. But, yeah, I just thought that'd be a whole lot lower. How about, so all you know is going back 7 or 8 years is what you're saying? And you believe it's in that 250, 275 range? So you wouldn't have any information based upon what's happened, let's say, since July, this fiscal year, because if somebody got an incident number, would they have had time to close it out since then?
Potentially, we have closed some in that time frame. Not, it's not normal, not the usual.
ERC.
Yeah, if you had an ERC, normally it would be, those would have tendency to be a service release or release reported at closure with an excavation. Those are the ones that tend to go a lot faster than ERC. Those are the ones that were closed that time.
Wouldn't be in that time. So I don't want to hog up the time here, but I do have some questions concerning the audit, but I don't want to, if anybody had any other questions. Doug, at this point, I'll step aside before I get to those. I did go back and look at their random sites. I was a little confused about how those sites, how many there were. To me, it looks like there's 13 sites that are actually listed in their attachments. As at one point, they talk about 10. And so I'm trying to figure out, how were those sites chosen? Were they just completely random? The company that did the audit just grabbed whatever
Yeah,
they
they-
wanted off the virtual file cabinet, basically?
They picked those, as far as I know, it was random. The agency had no part in that one. We developed the scope of the audit. They went and did their work. So we did not pick those sites. We didn't direct them to any of those sites. The VFC was already there. So as far as I know, that they picked those random. But I don't know what methodology they used to select them.
I found it odd for some reason that I think 8 of those was prior to 2000. So I felt like that could have affected some of their conclusions and recommendations because they're way higher than what something would be today. Because the $300,000 figure was a lot higher. It's just dropped down since you started utilizing the risk-based corrective action. So, I mean, I don't know what it was at one time, but could have been double it. And so 8 of the sites they picked to at random to kind of show as an example of how we should changes we should make to the fund or 25 years old. 8 of it, over half of them. And then only 1 was since 2015. So the rest of them, the other 4 were sometime in the early 2000s. I don't know the exact date. I don't know that it really matters. It just seemed like we're still using this higher number and making recommendations based upon cleanups that were done, like Peggy said, without any risk-based corrective action or the utilization of an ERC. So that those numbers are greatly inflated. And I would think that for this particular audit, it would have been nice if they would have used maybe more current exposure responses. So, and again, if they just picked them randomly on their own, there was also 8 sites, and I don't know which 8, that had more than 1 consultant. So at least 2. And so I think that would always, there's usually a disconnect, maybe some repetitive work that needs to be done. And so they didn't take that into consideration if it's just been 1 consultant working on the site. And it was, over half of the sites they utilized. So again, I think that's kind of tough to make. Or some of the sweeping recommendations they want us to do, which again, I agree with them. I just wish we had kind of more, and again, you can't go back to July 2022, but maybe since the last audit was published, which 2016, right?
Yes.
And this is we're supposed to, and we're supposed to just there's an audit, right? It's supposed to be commissioned every 5 years, is
Every
that?
5, yeah.
So we'll have another one in 2027.
Yes.
That'll probably be posted at the end of that year or sometime in January.
Hopefully, yeah.
Will it be done by the same company?
We don't know, we'll put out the RFP for that when it comes about, and discussing that one. So, and for the next one, I'm not sure, I mean, that could be something you guys can think about, whether you want to have another managerial audit or computer actuarial. So that'll be up to you guys to decide that one.
Probably depends on if any of these recommendations we accept or don't accept, and how the numbers look in 3 or 4 years. It'd be difficult to say now.
The RFP process is long.
There is a statement in the audit, and I may be one of the few people here other than Chris or Matt who's read every word of that audit. And you're right, the first part of the audit, way over my head, so. But I did read every word of every page. But there is a comment in there where they say, throughout our analysis, we have, without audit or verification, relied on historical data and qualitative information provided by IDA. So you're saying it's on the virtual file cabinet, so they had access to everything. You guys put it there. So that's the answer to that question.
Yeah, so it's a basic disclaimer on their part. They didn't go and audit our database, for instance, right? And do a whole data validation project. And that's what they're saying, I think. They're relying on the information that's in the virtual file cabinet and in our Ulster's database.
I only go back to 2022, and this is for my own information. How many ISDs have we requested, since July of 2022?
I don't know for sure.
Do you have a
We could pull that.
guesstimate?
No, I can pull the information. That's logged in milestones in the database. We could pull that information. I get that.
Would it be equal to the number of confirmed releases?
No, not necessarily. It's, we've utilized ISCs, we've utilized limited subsurface investigations. If the circumstances are right for that, we've also utilized site checks, as well as closure reports.
How about corrective action plans since 2020, July of 2022?
A handful.
Would, in general, would an ERC, would you request, since you said before that ERCs are in essence corrective action, would you ask for a corrective action plan to be written on every confirmed release site? And therefore they have to talk about these institutional controls?
No, it's not required for, so a corrective action plan is a different thing than overarching corrective action. So I know that those terms get thrown around interchangeably, but they are not. So like I said, the corrective action itself is a regular term of art that refers to the whole process from start to finish. Corrective action plan is only required if you're doing certain types of act remediation. So one of the examples that I've used is if you're doing a closure and you're over excavating soils and disposing of that at point of closure, that's not necessarily something we would require a corrective action plan for, even though it's active, because it slows down the process. It kind of defeats the purpose. You want, when it's open, get it out, you can take care of that at that point. So that would be one. A corrective action plan would be for, if it's not a closure and you're doing a soil excavation or a remediation system, or sometimes mobile back fence, it just is dependent on the circumstances.
But not for institutional control?
No. No, I think that would be, kind of a waste of time for everyone to require a corrective action plan to put an institutional control on a property. There's already a separate process for that. So going through writing corrective action plans, maybe the agency review of that, just when we're already going to be reviewing the ERC, I think is, kind of superfluous, so.
Okay. Can you explain that process and you don't need an ISC?
Sure. So the current form of the remediation program guide, if you are it's based on priority level priority. So you have low, medium, and high priority. Low and medium priority sites would be result in an LSI or something less. An ISC would be required for a high priority incident. Those with known impacts to groundwater and potential, higher level priority potential vapors, things of that sort would require an ISC. Things that only involve soil contamination would not require an ISC, for sure. And even in the instance that there could potentially, that it could be a potential high priority release, if we have a closure report, we may utilize that and get right to moving into further site investigation. It would just be dependent on all the circumstances.
What about free product?
Free product?
Would you ask for an ISC?
Free product? Yeah, an ISC. If it's true free product, as opposed to residual LMAP.
Anybody else have any questions about the audience? I did note in there that the audit talks about fraud about, within the agency. They found no fraud within the agency or from, bank owners that submit claims.
That would be based on, with the files that they reviewed. That's,
Only those files.
yes.
You read my mind. So
Yeah, it was
it's
not-
only on those 8 files.
Right.
And, has the agency ever found evidence of fraud from someone, a tank owner, or their assignee submitting a claim?
Yep.
Have they ever been prosecuted?
Um,
I'm aware.
no, not sure. So, but as far as that's concerned, we don't get to elect to prosecute, right? That goes to local prosecutors or, or justice.
You just would make certain recommendations, I assume, the proper authorities.
Yeah.
Do you think that should be, I don't know what the word is, a priority or, we're overseeing the fund. If we have someone who has taken advantage of the fund in some way, shouldn't we have a legal ramification to get that back? How would we go about that?
It's a good question. Like I said, as far as the agency is concerned, if and when we find suspected fraud, we report that. And then it goes to those authorities and they investigate, decide whether to prosecute or not. As far as, if you're asking a question standing for the board, that's a more difficult question.
Yeah, I will say that, we have, a group within our agency that engages in criminal investigations, just overall, agency functions, and they work with other, like EPA has a group like that, and, you know, so when we find something that it can be, you know, a common example would be if, someone is open burning somewhere, and get those complaints from, you know, out in the various counties and things. That's what our folks will review that, and if there's an environmental function to it, we, if one's looking at the case, we can refer those to the prosecutor in that county. And then at that point, they are free to either bring the case or not. That's essentially when we uncover anything that is considered a criminal type of a situation related to any of our programs. That's the process that we generally use. And so that would, I would think,
So in that example, if somebody submitted a false claim and there was a pattern, you would turn it over to the county that they're in, their prosecutor.
that one, and we've not done this, so I don't know. It may well be that there are some internal processes that would involve the inspector general, things like that, that we would have to review in terms of what the process is from the state perspective. If it's a fund that, like, for example, if it's a fraud on a fund for which the agency is the administrator. So that changes that a little bit. It's not just sort of like, you know, someone's burning tires in their back field, and so it's a local prosecutorial issue. I do believe that it would involve, I get in this place. I do believe it would involve, you know, speaking with, how that would work within the state structure, and the inspector general is involved in some of that. Sometimes the attorney general is involved as well. They're different. We've not had to deal with it, so I'm just kind of speculating here.
We never, you made some recommendations, but no one's ever prosecuted. So
I've
you do-
not made recommendations as pertains to fraud for this particular fund per se, but how we generally have, when we find something that is considered a violation. Sometimes is something, it can be as mundane as burning tires, and, you know, it's creating a nuisance, and it's also illegal. That's referred to the prosecutor in that particular county and to whether to bring it, things like that. But this would be a different issue because it's a fund that is administrated by the agency. So I would likely think there would be a different process.
But we don't know what that process is because it's never happened. We haven't
Right.
recommended.
I've not looked at it to see what that process would be.
Yes.
We've not investigated actively to look for fraud in this program.
To get the state funds that have been fraud committed against them, it would go to the inspector general, the attorney general of the state of Indiana.
Because you cited, you didn't give me any details. I didn't ask for any details. You volunteered the information, an outrageous example of someone taking advantage of the fund. I think at our last meeting. And you had said that you were making some recommendations like the next day. Did that ever go in?
I mean, it's, like I said, the way that it works is because you have two different functions. You have an administrative function, and then you have this criminal function in the same organization. And so when we make that referral, it's a blind between us and that, right? So our internal or our regular everyday administrative processes need to be separate from any of their investigations, to keep those clean. So as soon as we make that referral, my hands are off at that point.
Okay, makes sense.
Does that make sense?
So it could be ongoing, it could be done. It's the front page of the Indianapolis Star or something. But for our purposes as a board, we've never had, as far as we know, you guys know, no one's ever committed fraud that got to the level that they were going to be prosecuted. So,
As far as I know, right,
and the audit backed all that up.
with the limited claims that are previous.
Yeah, I had a couple questions that I think we covered about the, lowering the fund, and again, I'd be perfectly happy with that. I think your argument would be with two guys sitting in the front row, and maybe we'll talk about it here in a minute, but, I know that you want tank owners to kind of be accountable, be involved in the process. I think, as chairman of the FAB board, I would welcome that. As environmental consultant business owner, we welcome that every day. And I've told people many times, if we want to make something happen here, you need to go to that IDEM meeting with me. If I just go, it's like I'm a consultant complaining, like consultants probably do all the time. But if you show up there with me and voice your concerns, it'll be taken differently.
It's definitely a better form of communication to have everybody.
I mean, it's for their benefit. This is not for the benefit of the consultant, which is why we are getting out the direct pay world fast and furiously. For one, tired of being in the bank. For another, you kind of have to be a psychologist and keep everybody pumped up in the process, from employees to the tank owners and everyone else. It's just isn't. I just don't define it as part of our job. It was a way to get work in the beginning, but our clients are all well established and they don't need it, they don't want it, then so it's their battle with you. Like, but I have had a few examples where before we've even asked for ELF eligibility, we've been told in a letter, go out and do this thing and this thing, but don't do this thing. And if you do this thing, we're not going to pay for it under ELF. And we haven't even filed for ELF eligibility. So are they just kind of warning us in advance, warning the tank owners in advance? Is that a necessary process you see that your office must take?
I think so. I mean, just ensuring that we know exactly which costs would be considered and which would not be before any of the work is done. I think it's incumbent on the agency to make that clear, and the point that decision is made.
Before anyone even knows whether you're gonna file for ELF eligibility and before we even know if it's going to be ELF eligible.
Yeah, I mean, the assumption is that it will be upheld with the new, with new rules and requirements or statutory requirements for eligibility. Most sites that are reported now should be considered eligible. The only requirement obviously is time of reporting of the release. And a report for us to differentiate whether this is indeed a new and confirmed release. So,
Well, believe it or not, there are tank owners out there that don't want to use ELF and don't use ELF.
I know.
So, and then they get this, Jason, are you filing ELF eligibility when you already talked about this? And it's just a surprising new language that I've noticed has been added to some correspondence that
it's just us trying to provide clarity is all. And this goes back to the 9/8/21 issue, right? So if we knew for certain what financial responsibility mechanism everyone was going to be relying on in the first 30 days of the release, we potentially approach our templates.
And then I have a few other examples, but leave it at this one, I guess. There's been times when you're not requesting an ISC. You're requesting something other than an ISC. And you're saying, not you specifically, but somebody within your office is saying, hey, go out and do borings. They can be hand augering, but confirm the direction of groundwater flow and how fast it's moving.
I need to be provided those examples. So provide me with those examples, I'll look into it and I'll.
Because you know that's impossible to do.
Give me the examples and I'll get back to
And it's happened more than once. You can't,
you.
there's
Provide
no
me-
way without 3 wells in a
provide me-
granular fashion that you can calculate groundwater flow.
If you provide me with the examples, I will look into those and respond. Yeah. You said that was the last one.
Oh, I did. I have asked one more question about reasonable cost effectiveness. Is there some kind of standards published someplace? I mean, I know you refer to something, we refer to something. I don't know if we're all looking at the same thing. Is there something published somewhere where if it says, you're gonna go do this, this is what it should cost, and this is what you should do?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, we have the NPD guidance, right? So that's one thing that can be utilized as being pre-approved as reasonable cost effective for those certain tasks. And then.
But not everything falls into the
Right,
nice
right.
lump sum within that guidance document.
Right, exactly. And some of it is, it's going to be dependent on the work. Okay, so do we have 3 competitive bids? What do the 3 competitive bids look like? What are you trying to attempt to do? We've come across some issues that were not issues. We've had some that ended up being issues where a lot more work was performed than was reasonable to get that task done, meaning, a 5 foot by 5 foot patch of asphalt was all that needed, and somebody wanted 25 by 20. But I know that we had one of yours where once everything was submitted to us, we're like, oh yeah, well, that makes sense. If I was underestimated a little bit, and you can see it all right there, and that makes sense, right? So we had to have it both ways. And it just is gonna depend on the entirety of the circumstances, for sure.
But someone,
Let's make it back to communication.
Yeah, I agree. And, on this specific one, it was just a timing issue.
Yeah.
And I think they couldn't get on site. And so, they were giving their best educated guess and it will short. And we looked at that once we got the information and it was fine.
Because
And
it's,
we agree.
there's just that communication. And he thinks it's reasonable, you don't, and then you disagree, but it's the tank owner pays it. And the tank owner really relying on you guys to understand what is proper. That's like pre-communicating before the expense. So you're doing it before the expense, not after the expense, and trying to
Right.
justify.
And getting to and moving forward, I mean, this is where task-based cost guidelines are much more helpful. But I think it takes a ton of that guesswork out of that.
And again,
that will alleviate that.
if you went that way and it was spelled out and all agreed upon before it, go for it. But right now, the reasonable cost effectiveness, I mean, there's different interpretations. I mean, somebody at your agency is making a determination in their minds, what this tank owner is asking for is not reasonable and cost effective. So if somebody's educated, yes. Based upon maybe other similar sites or other sites that maybe they've worked on or their colleagues have worked on, or you've been dealt with personally, but there's not a sheet somewhere that says, hey, follow this, tank owners, and you won't have, everything will be approved.
Right.
Nothing will get denied for reasonable cost effectiveness.
That's the runs of the language. That's why, like I said, the task-based stuff and go into that will create a lot of that guesswork. And hopefully dispel a lot of those issues with the way that the language is written right now. It is broad. And it does require us to take in, the whole picture.
Is that the claims reviewer making that decision? Is that the claims reviewer in conjunction with your project manager at IDEM? That those two and you somehow also involved, all 3 of you making that decision?
It's gonna vary. It's gonna vary depending on what the issues are and what was seen. It's not going to be the same every time because all these claims are a little bit different. But it could involve the project manager and what was demanded. It could involve claims reviewers and, eventually trickle its way up to me. It could make its way to Tim or Katie, and reviewing a lot of these. Now, every claim that goes through, whether denied or approved, does pass through at minimum section sheet. So, but yeah, I mean, it will just depend on what the issues actually are.
I don't know, but I would assume that a lot of your reviewers don't have a lot of practical field experience, haven't done this out in the field very much. They probably know what they're looking at and what they're seeing, but still somewhat new to them.
I mean, not necessarily. So what we do have is a lot of claim reviewers that have been reviewing these claims for decades, a lot of them. So, and we do have a project management staff that do have that experience and field experience, plus we have, we have evidence and information that we can review from, brownfield sites, and looking for some of those at some of our other sites, that maybe aren't health funded, not necessarily on a cost by cost basis, but on a, project basis.
You've answered my question. I appreciate it. I'm not trying to make a big deal out of it. Just if someone's educated opinion to the best of their knowledge with the information they have, their experience level and what they've seen and what their colleagues have seen. Just want to make sure that that's how I thought it was. If there was a set of standards somewhere that you weren't sharing or couldn't share or didn't share, that I was going to recommend you should share. But and I knew the policy document was out there, but it's just once these things they're not cookie cutters put in there. I appreciate your time, Doug. Thank you. Where are we at now? Other matters, which means open forum. Who wants to go first?
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Braun, partner with Blue Shadow Richard Braun, Indianapolis. For the last 30 years, I've had the privilege of serving as the general counsel for the Association of Gas Station and Convenience Store Operators Indiana, currently known now as the Indiana Food and Fuel Association. I'd like to touch today briefly on sort of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going, including some new legislation that's pending over the State House right now. From 2010 to 2015, we began to see a pretty rapid increase in the cost of closure in the state of Indiana. In 2016, we approached IDEM and the Financial Insurance Board and asked them to hire outside auditors to come in and do both a actuarial study as well as a managerial study to figure out where we were from a financial standpoint and what we could do from an operational standpoint. They went out and they did. They hired two independent companies that came in, best practices and analysis. And the reason for that was, back in 2017, in our surrounding states, in Ohio, the average cost to clean up and achieve closure was $117,000. For Illinois, it was $85,000. For Kentucky, it was $79,000. The national average was $150,000. In the state of Indiana, we were $524,000. We were more than 3 times the cost of closure nationally. So we saw that there was a significant problem there that needed to be addressed. The audit came back and IDEM, to its credit, embraced the recommendations, embraced the changes. One of the findings was, if we don't change our ways, the fund will be insolvent by 2026. And so IDEM, with the support of IFFA and many others, adopted the recommendations made back in 2016. And they continue to make progress, as you've seen from the report minutes ago. It's dropped from $524,000 down to $300,000. We're still 4th highest in the country. So the audit results from this past study, and as Doug indicated, now it's going to be done every 5 years. And there were a number of things there, and it's a bit confusing on this whole negative equity discussion. The reality is, to cut the chase, 10 years from now, we'll have $40 million more in the account we have today, right? So what they did was they took the current number and they said, but then they also added in all your future costs, and that's why you have a negative equity balance. And so it's a bit confusing, but the reality is we're on much more solid ground today. The fund has grown in the past couple of years from about $90 million to $166 million today. This past year, there were 106 different companies that received funds. Fund paid out $12.6 million last year. Creek Run, American Environmental, a lot of the mainstays in the environmental consulting world were very active and received funding out of it, and that's fantastic. That's the purpose of the fund. As a tank owner representative, we need the fund viable. We have to meet a federal mandate for $1 million coverage for environmental liabilities. And as Jason indicated earlier, and Doug, we have the highest reimbursement level in the country at $2.5 million. One of the recommendations was that needs to be reduced. And so progress is being made. And where we are today is IDEM has embraced, as more than 24 other states have, a risk-based cleanup standard. And what that means is you're not cleaning up down to non-detect. You're cleaning up down to the point where it does not present human health or a threat to human health of the environment. So it's safe. It's below ground, and there's not a pathway for it to migrate upward that would pose a threat to human health of the environment. But you're leaving residual contamination in the ground. That's expected. That's what a risk-based cleanup program contemplates. And so there's nothing unusual or untoward about having residual contamination in the ground. The ERC, the purpose of that is to put the world on notice that there is residual contamination there. The ERC is to let people know that You've got, for instance, impacted groundwater, and you cannot put in a drinking water well. Well, many of these sites are in places where there's city water, city sewer. It does not restrict the use of the property. It does not change the character of the property. Is it a limitation on the property? As Nevis indicated, it is. I mean, it's something you've recorded and put on notice to the world that it's a restriction, but does it change the use of the site? And the answer is no. You typically, these are commercial properties, and it puts you on notice that if you're going to dig down, for instance, and put a new building there, put new footers in, if there's residual soil contamination down there, you're on notice of it, and you've got to coordinate with IDEM to make sure that it's properly investigated and disposed of accordingly. So there's nothing, again, wrong with that. It's just make sure that everyone knows and put on notice that before you go out and buy a piece of property, that there is some residual contamination there. The fund continues to be viable, and we contemplated that a year ago. And we looked at ways to work with consultants. We worked with IDEM and many others to figure out what were the ways in which we might be able to expand eligibility under the fund. And one of the things that we identified is, and I put together is Senate Bill 246. And it's a great bill, and it came out of the Senate 49-0. It's scheduled for a hearing in the House on the 29th of March. I understand from my very esteemed and highly qualified colleague, Matt Norris, he's been meeting with lots of folks, so there's a lot of support for it. And here are some of the reasons for it. Because keep in mind, this fund has been the source of the most successful cleanup program in the state of Indiana. We've got more sites cleaned up from the health fund than any other IDEM program by far. Doesn't mean it doesn't need some improvement and tweaking now and then, but it's been a great program. And so what we're looking at now is we're going to expand eligibility to, number one, include above ground storage tanks that are used in the storage and distribution of fuel to the retail and public. So if you have a bulk plant and you're a petroleum marketer, for instance, and it goes from the terminal, and instead of going directly to the gas station, it goes to a bulk storage facility, that facility will now be eligible for reimbursement under the L fund to get cleaned up. So they've already collected the pay per gallon because it's collected at the terminal. So before it was ever distributed to either the bulk plant or to the gas station, we've already collected for years and years, penny per gallon on that. So we think that's an appropriate expansion program to effectuate more cleanups. One of the things we did also is we expanded it to include airports. A lot of airports, both small and large, have above ground storage facilities for their fuel, for their jets. And so we have included airports as part of the bill that are going to be eligible for reimbursement. We've also, and again, these are first in the nation proposals, right? We would be the first program in the country through an underground storage tank fund to fund above ground storage tank cleanups used in the fuel distribution business. A second first in the nation will be, we have over 1,700 underground storage tank systems that are more than 25 years old. I don't want to say they're ticking time bombs, but they have the potential that when they fail, they're catastrophic losses and the loss of fuel and releases. And so these can be $500,000 or $1 million or more cleanup. And so what we've proposed, and again, it came through the Senate and it's now for consideration in the House, is that we're going to now use ELF money for UST compliance. Again, first in the nation to do this. It's very progressive. It's exciting, but we're now going to go out, and especially for the mom and pop operators in the state of Indiana, the cost to remove, decommission the old system, pull out the pipes, everything else, and put in a new one, it's extraordinarily expensive. I mean, you could easily spend, Tom was talking at lunch, it could easily be $400,000, $500,000, $600,000. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pay the cost to remove the tanks, and pay 50% of the cost of a new system going in. And we've stair-stepped it so that the maximum benefit will be to the smaller operators. So if you have 1 to 12 tanks, they'll be at $7.5 million per year, $10 million per year available for you to effectuate those upgrades. So we'd rather be proactive on the front end and spend $200,000 or $300,000 to get a brand new system installed instead of waiting for the catastrophic release. And they don't have the money for the UST system replacement, and we're now spending $500,000 or $1 million or more to effectuate a cleanup. For those who have between 12 and 100 tanks, there's $7.5 million per year available. And if you've got more than 100 tanks, there's $2.5 million available there as well. So the FAB, IDEM, and the UST community are going to be very proactive from an environmental standpoint to effectuate more cleanups. And also, and this is something that Doug alluded to a moment ago, again, another fantastic feature of this bill is that we have a reopener, right? So a gas station, you clean it up, there's residual contamination there. But a lot of times gas stations want to sell and no longer be in the fuel business, right? The petroleum retail side, they may want to sell to a CVS, because these are generally on good corners, right? So a CVS or Walgreens or some other fast food place might want to come in, but they don't want to buy it because there's residual contamination there. What this bill says now is we're going to allow you to reopen ELF eligibility and go back in and clean up so there's no residual. It's not going to be a brownfield site anymore. It's not going to be an impediment to trying to sell these properties. So it's going to allow us to, but you're going to be permanently decommissioned as a fuel facility. So you're going to have to take it out and sell from gas station A to gas station B owner. It's not going to be a reopener. But if you sell it to a non-petroleum end user, then you are going to be eligible. Another thing, and this goes, I think, to a concern that Jason indicated earlier, the bill also includes, it was an import from Senate Bill 389, is we're also going to make sure that there's an initial site characterization that will be performed and submitted to IDEM before any kind of ERC or NFA request will be issued by IDEM. And that way, both the current owner and future owners would at least know what's out there in terms of any contamination. And that will be in addition to any other information they might want to gather, but that will be in there as well. There's also some, and I won't bore with the details, but there's some minor cleanup in the bill as well. We're the oversight of the tank inspector program, IDEM project management oversight costs now are going to be explicitly included in the bill. So the bill makes a lot of sense. It makes sense from an environmental standpoint. It's fiscally sound. It's an appropriate expansion of the program from where we are today. As we talk about some of the items here, I can go to the next one. Jumping it up. Again, the equity balance is it's a confusing explanation, but the reality is the fund's going to have at the current pace right now $40 million more 10 years from now than where we are today. So we're on very solid footing. The managerial changes on the ELF audits, again, the IFFA, we support this. We'd like to see IDEM work with both the tank owners and the environmental consulting communities in coming up with details for recommendations on things we might be able to do to improve, continue transparency, efficiency. We wholeheartedly support doing away with the assignment of rights as the fund or as the outside consultant and doing the audit determined that when a tank owner assigns his or her rights to reimbursement to the fund to an environmental consultant, that the cost and that cleanup is now 400% more than the tank owner pays it directly. We've had some, excessive costs. We had, the Golars lawsuit that everyone's aware of. They started off asking for 14.4 million and sold it for 3.2. I mean, it's 22 cents on the dollar. Doesn't mean it's, just because a cost gets disallowed, it's not reasonable, doesn't mean it's fraudulent. Those are two very different things. And we have a lot of hardworking consultants that submit things. The work was done, they put the time in, but IDEM has determined in certain instances that they're not reasonable costs, are not cost effective. And there's a natural tension there between the two, but that's fine. That's part of the process. But we think doing away with the assignment of rights will dramatically reduce the cost of those sites as well and get the owners back involved and engaged with the environmental investigation and cleanup. Again, we'd encourage IDEM to work with the UST owners and the environmental consulting community to come up with what would be appropriate for pre-approval. What should we do competitive bidding? I do think we should reduce the reimbursement cap. I think 2.5 million is excessive. One of the things that the audit report came back with, they said that why not make it $1 million for cleanup costs and then put some additional money in for a third-party claim and or attorney's fees. And they put 250,000 in for attorney's fees. As an attorney, I'm telling you, that's way too high, right? I think that you could reduce that down. But I would keep money aside for third-party claims. So if you want to do 1.5 million, $1 million for cleanup, $400,000 for, or 450 even for third-party claims, and then some for attorney's fees that are allowed, that would be appropriate. But I think we need to remove the incentive to maximize reimbursement of the fund as we go forward. So we look forward to IDEM and working with everyone in adopting new and improved ways to handle the fund. But we're excited about where we're going forward. We think that, and our hope is that the airport, and we'll tell you one thing, that there is a not competing, but there's another bill out there in terms of an airport. We've already included airports in 246 that would allow airports and above ground tanks to be eligible. There's been a request made in some legislation that's pending right now that they would set up basically a micro fund of the L fund that would be limited just to airports. The IFFA opposes that. We don't think all of a sudden it would be a bad precedent because now every interest group, it could be a school district that has 200 school buses. They come and say, well, now we want to have our own fund and have whatever we pay in, we get to pay out. When you pay homeowners premiums for 20 years, you don't have claims. You don't get to go back to them and say, okay, now I'm ready to get reimbursed by all my premiums. Just because the airport has not had claims equal to what they paid in the fund, we don't think is appropriate to have it reimbursed. So we think that having the above ground tanks as well as underground tanks at airports covered, that's consistent with the environmental purpose of the fund. We just don't think that, giving airports money to build hangars for $1 million jets or repaving runways are appropriate use of funds. So with that, we will, and my esteemed colleague Matt Norris will be tackling that and hopefully sharing his view on that bill. But we think that, again, this 246 is an outstanding bill. It's one that the FAB, I think, will, and hopefully will be very proud of. The environmental consulting community and the tank owners are very excited about it. It opens up the possibility for literally thousands of sites to now be investigated and cleaned up and paid for in the fund. It'll be first in the nation. So it's very exciting. So that's sort of a quick history of the past, where we are and where we're going in the future. So I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone might have on any of those fronts.
I agree with you with Senate Bill 246, especially the amendment from 389. I've worked hard to get that in there. I think at a bare minimum, that's what I didn't need to ask. I'll continue to say that just like I have to the commission. Reference to 1072 that has now made it to the House. When did that pass in the House?
What the vote was?
Yeah, do you know?
I don't know. I think it was unanimous.
It was, if not unanimous, significant,
So is that being heard next week in the Senate?
to be determined.
I liked your analogy about the homeowners insurance, but there are some people that elect not to have homeowners insurance and pay for whatever cost. Maybe if you have a mortgage, you can't do that, but there are people that elect not to have certain types of insurance, and if they have an issue, they have to pay for it out of pocket. So,
Yeah, we'll stay on that. And I agree with Doug. I think we continue to work together to improve reimbursement rates. But I can tell you, as someone who's worked with a lot of insurance companies, you don't routinely get 100 cents on the dollar when you submit claims. Ask anybody who's got a house in Florida right now trying to get reimbursement. If they can get 50 cents on the dollar, they're all just thrilled. This is operating largely as like an insurance fund, but even with private insurance, it's oftentimes very difficult to get 100 cents on the dollar of everything you submit, because they go through the same analysis. Was it reasonable? Was it cost effective? Was it appropriate? And that's part of their job, to manage claims and that sort of thing. And that's sort of what, ITEM is doing here at managing the fund. But our hope is we can continue to improve the 70% reimbursement rate up to a much higher level and remove or reduce the number of resubmittals, things that get denied for lack of documentation, et cetera. Those are sort of, self-inflicted wounds. If we can put in the proper documentation, we can get there. So I think whether we get to 100%, I don't know if that's realistic, but I think if we can substantially improve above 70%, that would be a good thing for everybody.
1072, the last I heard was maybe 2 million a year on the fund back to the airport authorities.
Right.
And their argument is they're using very little, if any. I plan on attending the hearing, whatever it is. I'm not going to speak pro or against it, just as an interested taxpaying citizen.
But, every trucking company in the state, every school district in the state, if you open up the precedent now to say, okay, we're going to now start separately, Doug and the commissioner would love to get out of the claims handling and the insurance business, right? I mean, the last thing they want is to have set up yet another fund and separately monitor who's paid in, what's been paid out. It's, another administrative challenge for them to do it. And, items already got their hands full running the ELF in addition to everything else. So my hope is that the State House, they ultimately conclude the airports are properly covered from an environmental standpoint, and they can run their claims just like everyone else does through ELF, and not set up a separate micro fund.
I understand.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Anyone else like to speak? I know, we had a couple of people that had, that brought some issues before me.
My name's Troy Smith, and I'm the president of IWM Consulting Group. You know, with the L Fund, I'm glad we have it there. I look at the fund a little differently than some others. As a consultant, I think I can put myself in my customer's best interest when I do this job. So I look at through their eyes of what I think is best. Right off, you know, we've got a disagreement on assignment of rights. I actually think we're a little bit tainted in Indiana because we had some people that were definitely abusing the program. I think some of that responsibility was IDEM because they should be the ones that are actually doing these reviews. I think we've taken some definite steps by pre-approval process or having flat approval dollar figures. A little bit frustrated at times though, when I get a pre-approval and I still get denied because I actually come in under cost because I use a less expensive, you know, sampling equipment, or else I used a less expensive person or something like that. Then the whole task gets denied, which to me, that's silly. But some of those things got to work through, I guess, to get there. I actually, on assignment of rights, I do use assignment rights. But I take the responsibility that if we don't get reimbursed, that's on me. That's not on the customer. If you want to take that on, that's great for you, I guess, but that means that we have to do our job. We have to be efficient with it. And if we're doing approval process, but then that has a responsibility of IDEM to look over to make sure what I'm doing is actually proper. I think that would almost be better if we all did that and work together than just do away with all together, because, you know, some of these are small business guys out there, and it is a difficult situation to go through and fund that. I can set that out there and wait to get paid. Hopefully it's not always 69 days or whatever number we're at, but that's part of the process of being in business as a small business owner. As far as House Bill 246, I think there's a lot of great things in there. I know Tom Newcomb, he's got a tough job with, you know, there's a lot of old worn out UST systems out there. And we definitely, this would be a great boom to the business if we have a way to make it a little bit easier to upgrade some of these systems, because, you know, I'm currently getting quotes together and we're looking at $350,000, $400,000 to pull tanks and install new ones. That's still a huge expense, but $100,000 makes it much better than what it was. I not completely agree with some of the language that we kind of section out gas stations and say, well, if you don't want to be a gas station, now we'll find to clean you up. I just want to make sure we've issued a lot of NFAs on these old worn out sites that we put ERC in place, that now we're going to go ahead and put new tanks in there. I've already had a lot of customers that have had to expense that soil of 800,000 tons of contaminated soil, that because it's got an ERC on it with an NFA, it's not reimbursed. So I hopefully that's cleaned up, that we can at least get that reimbursed when we do upgrade all these tanks out there. But I just think when we put that wording in place, that if you don't want to be a gas station, then that sets a precedent. Well, maybe we won't pay for it when you are a gas station. I mean, the time to, on a gas station, to go after it is when you have those tanks out of the ground, and we should do that contamination source removal. Personally, I don't think we're really doing any corrective action right now. We're doing delineation. If we have those, and it's hard for a gas station. When you're active, it's hard to really do much of anything effective, cost effectively as well. But when we made the decision, we're going to pull those tanks, it's a great time to get the massive contamination out the ground and do what we can do. So, you know, I agree with a lot of these things and think it's great. ISC thing, you know, we're both consultants, but I don't see that we necessarily always have to have an ISC, to be honest with you. Sometimes we have very minimally impacted sites that we were doing site check. Sometimes we were told to report a suspected release on something that we didn't think it was a release. And so if we put 3 wells in the ground and then just pull them out, I don't know if that's my customer's best interest. I mean, the thing is, if it's contaminated, we did a site check, we're still gonna go back and put an ISC and put the wells in anyway. So I mean, the consultant's getting to work, but I gotta look if I think that it's worth the merit to you spend twice the money or more so on an ISC versus a site check. Just kind of where I'm going. Thank you.
Thanks, Troy.
Hello, my name is Lauren Nielsen. And I'm a licensed professional engineer specializing in environmental engineering. And I would like to echo what Troy said about the ISCs. For those of you who don't know what the definition of an ISD is, it actually has a definition in the rules, 329 IC 9(5) defines what constitutes an ISD, and it's pretty extensive. And maybe I'm lazy, but I don't want to do that every time, and I don't want to charge my clients for that every time. I've recently got into what makes a lot more sense to me as an engineer, which is preventing releases, and that ties in directly to compliance, which is intended to prevent things from being released to the environment. Then there's no problem. It doesn't matter if there's, you don't even need to think about it. It's never happened. So that's where my business has been directed, is to help people understand the regulations that are intended to prevent releases. And so I definitely applaud the first part of the Senate Bill 246, which is starting very, just budding part of allocating health funds for preventing releases, which would be removing the tanks that are about to fail before they do. So that does make a lot of sense. It's unfortunate for the folks who decided to remove their tanks, on their own dime, because they were being studious to the environment. But so I truly would like to know what it is about an ISC that is any better than like a site check that would help inform whether an ERC is an appropriate next step. So, I think you're the only one who can speak to it, Jason. Can you explain to me what it is that an ISC has that it would be missing from some other form? Like
Sure.
a closure?
Glad to. After a confirmed release, before an ERC is placed on the site, I think we need at least 3 soil borings and 3 monitoring wells, so we can calculate the direction, groundwater flow, see if there's any soil contamination, see if there's any groundwater contamination. That's all I'm asking for. 3 borings, 3 wells, calculate the direction, groundwater flow.
So-
And then, if IDEM, the agency, wants to put an ERC on the site, then they have this report that documents what was left in the ground. So as you know, with the site check, we get these all the time, go out and do a hand auger, this spot. That's the kind of site checks that I see.
40 CFR 280 states that you shall check for the presence of contamination at the place where it's most likely to be found, meaning the source. So you can identify the impetus for the release.
And then you find it, and then you report it, and they say, yeah, we're gonna put an ERC on.
Right, yes, and most times that's all you have to do, because if there is a release confirmed and it's confined to the immediate vicinity of the dispenser where it occurred, there's no reason to drill or install wells and collect groundwater samples. That is unduly burdensome to the client, who will never see this money again, because it's not gonna get into ELF realm, $15,000 for an ISC, maybe.
Well, I think the reason we disagree would be because I would have to tell a client if they want to put a deed restriction on your property, they want to circumvent your property rights, put an ERC on it without doing any due diligence. And a lot of times that due diligence will never even get to the level that they're going to accept money from this fund. Because in most cases, it's not going to be $15,000. And so it's always going to be their choice. And so when the agency doesn't ask for an ISC, and we try to educate our clients why we think it is still necessary and why it may not even reach the deductible. Of course, most of the time they want to know, well, why doesn't the agency want it? Why should I accept an ERC?
So I think maybe we're arguing about different things, because what I want to make clear is that in my experience, and granted, I don't have as much as other people in this room, but I have never witnessed an instance where IDEM has made a decision without enough information. Whether the information came from an ISC or from 50 soil borings that occurred during a tank pull, they have always had enough information to be able to see whatever happened and then make an informed decision, which is the fastest, cheapest, easiest solution for everyone. And I don't want to waste my time cleaning up water that no one is using over here, treating it and then spitting it out in the stream over here. Like, that just doesn't make sense. It's not common sense. So,
Well, an ISC is not an environmental cleanup.
no.
Again,
I
I've said it over and over. If IDEM does not want to ever clean up another site in Indiana, which at least, I mean, they're not saying that, but
Right, no.
they could tell, based on the risk-based corrective action, that's okay. But I think the client, the tank owners and the agency should know exactly what's there and what's not there. And sometimes that costs money. And to get a good direction on groundwater flow, so you can identify the sensitive receptors, you have to have 3 wells. There's no way around that.
Okay, so having enough information does not equate to you need an ISC. If you have a known quantity of substance that was released to the environment, you can use fate and transport modeling. You can use the adsorption characteristics of the soil that it came into contact with. There's decades of studies that have resulted in this really central site model for typical petroleum releases. And the fact is that ISCs are overkill most of the time, in my opinion. From my client's perspective, they don't want to do additional work if they don't have to, because I've been able to discover everything that's you need to know in order to make informed decisions without an ISC. Whether it was that I can see that there's a topographical relief toward a stream or a body of water, we don't need 3 monitoring wells to say it's going to flow that way. That there are other ways to gather enough information needed to fulfill risk-based corrective action.
So maybe the different discussion that needs to be had is there a new definition of ISC that is being proposed? There's a conversation being had at 3 wells, 3 borings,
On-site,
central site model.
389 says it references 329 ISC 95.
Correct.
That's the definition of ISC, and that's the one that they want to use.
But I think that the question that's being asked here is there a new definition of ISC that's being proposed, which is not the case? Is there an openness to IDEM to reissue the conversation of what an ISC is? That sounds like a different conversation for a different day, but.
Well, at the end of that rule, there's a clause that says, or equally protective of human health and environment. So that also technically meets the definition of an ISC. And so when IDEM asks for LSIs, that is already happening. It's just that the definition of the not or equally protective is what's being shoehorned into what's being required of any amount of petroleum left in the ground. And that's another part that bothers me, is that it says if a quantity is left. What does that mean? An unsafe quantity? Any quantity? Why would you need to do an ERC if there is a drop of petroleum? Anyone, whether they're environmental professional or not, can tell you that you really don't need to go to all that work for a drop of petroleum. So in conclusion, I have also, just full disclosure, used the ELF fund because I'm a consultant and I have never once experienced any trouble with cost effectiveness or reasonableness. I've been in communication with the folks who do the scope of work, or SOWs as we call it, and developed upfront a strategy along with the IDEM PM to clearly lay out exactly what we're going to do. And I can demonstrate what we're going to do will result in enough quantitative, qualitative information to achieve the purpose. And I've never had to I don't know, it's just not an issue to me. So it's surprising to me that there's still this issue of why is there a disconnect between what consultant considers reasonable and what I don't consider reasonable? Because those are the same thing to me and they always have been. I also want to clarify what risk-based corrective action is, because it's not a new thing. It didn't just come out in 2016. It's been around for like as long as I've been alive. And it really boils down to an engineering principle about what risk is. And that is hazard times exposure. And if you want to minimize or eliminate risk, one way to do it is to lower the hazard by reducing concentrations, or you can eliminate exposure. So you have 5 parts per billion benzene in your drinking water, but you're not drinking it, 5 times 0, 0. If you have 10,000 parts per billion in your groundwater benzene, and you're not drinking it, 10,000 times 0 is also 0. So that's where we define that we can control exposure, make sure that people are not drinking the poison, then the risk is 0, and it just is common sense to stop working there. I, again, have admittedly less experience than other people, but in every instance where I explain to a client what an ERC is, and to their bankers, I will gladly speak to anyone who questions what is this thing that's attached to my property that showed up in a phase 1. And I say, well, look, the provisions say, A, you shall not extract groundwater for any purposes other than for environmental investigation or remediation. 2, demonstrate that vapor intrusion is not going to be an issue if you should choose to change the use of the property or build a new building. Those things are easy to explain to people. And then it's just like a 5-minute phone conversation saying, okay, I understand, go ahead. It doesn't seem like there's this looming stain, I guess is the word, on someone's title because of an ERC. So I would like to just maybe hopefully clarify that it's not quite the villain that it seems to be made out to be. Every time that I've proposed an ERC, well, actually every closure that I've had was an ERC, because you can't get to unconditional closure levels no matter how hard you try. You could run a system for 99 years, 100 years, and never get drinking water standards. But if someone is not taking the water out of the ground and drinking it, the risk is still 0. So that's the engineering perspective. And I would really hope that in-house, the opportunity to amend 246, which is otherwise an excellent bill, would be used to remove the ERC, the ISC part, because all that will do is be a burden to tank owners who would otherwise be able to use funds to hire competent testing companies to do their compliance inspections and install overfill prevention valves that are functional and installed properly. And I would, looking farther into the future, I would love for people to be able to allocate those resources to better equipment, better testing companies, better maintenance companies who can respond to sensors that go off and understand what it means when an optical sensor has detected that there's fluid in the interstitial space, and then respond to it properly rather than waiting until there's a problem because some catastrophic release happens. And I'll stop talking now. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Chairman Lenz and members of the board. Matt Norris with Creek Developments, and I represent the Indiana Food and Fuel Association on governmental affairs matters, working very closely with Mr. Braun, as you heard earlier. I did want to touch on one thing, given the conversation recently. An idea that has been suggested in terms of amending Senate Bill 246 and the ISC language would be to include language allowing the owner or operator of the tank to waive the ISC requirement at their discretion. That would, of course, be in consultation with their environmental consultant. And I think everyone in this room probably knows more about the technical aspects of this issue than I do as a criminal affairs professional. But it seems like that idea has some merit. There's no language that's been put together, but that's something that we may be circulating in the next couple of days to see if that makes sense in addressing the comments that have been made by the two folks that preceded me up here. When an ISC may not be necessary in all occasions, but it leaves it at the discretion of the owner and operator to make that determination. So I just raised that as something that might be considered next week, so not my decision. But it will be something that we circulate amongst stakeholders to see if we can get support for that concept. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions about that.
Well, as we talked, I think the tank owner always has the decision to do whatever they want to do. Whether the agency requested or not, they could say, well, just because they requested, I don't want to do that, or because they didn't request it, I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I would always rely on what the tank owner wants to do. That's my job as his consultant.
Not having the language of the bill in front of me, I think it's a shall provision, which would take away that discretion, in my opinion, but again.
Yeah, I mean, we were asking for an ISC on a confirmed release, 3 borings, 3 wells. So I'm trying to give IDEM as much information as they need, or they should want, in my opinion. Information that they need to make a determination on whether they're going to restrict someone's property rights, which is what an ERC does. That's the request. I don't think you can do that with a site check. I've done, I don't know, 1,000 ISCs, and I've probably done 500 or more site checks on sites. And I'm proud to say that I've cleaned up 277 sites in the state of Indiana, and every one of them, I think, there may be a handful that didn't had an ISC and a corrective action plan, both of which were approved by the agency, some of which went into active remediation, some of which did not. But so I have been doing this for 30 years, and I know what an ISC does, and I know what a site check does. I know how Ohio looks at them. I know how Michigan looks at them. I know how Kentucky looks at them. I know how Illinois looks at them. That's the states that we work in. But when we ask for an ERC on a site that has free product, I'm telling my client, don't do it without an ISC. Let's find out where that product is going, how fast it's going to get there. And that's happened. And Doug wants me to give him that project incident number. I'll be glad to. So.
And again, I think the concept of this would be that those decisions would be made in consultation with the professional environmental consultant. And I would say that the dialogue here has been fantastic. I would encourage those that have an interest in this issue to show up at the hearing next week. It's not been scheduled, but we expect it to be next Wednesday afternoon in the House Environmental Affairs Committee, and maybe raise these same issues and thoughts during that hearing.
They should, I think the House Environmental Affairs Committee would.
I'm just
Welcome any and all.
prolonging their meeting next week.
So get there early and take your seat, so you don't have to stand the whole time.
But with that, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Anybody in the back of the room want to come up? Thought I saw a hand or two, but maybe I didn't.
I did want to make a quick comment on Troy's comment on the assignment of rights. As a consultant, I do fall in the same line as Troy, that I think maybe getting rid of the assignment of rights is not appropriate in all situations. We deal with a lot of, in the past, we've dealt with mom and pop station owners who just don't have the ability to deal with or the capacity to deal with a project site, and that's why they hire a consultant to do that. So in certain instances, and granted, full disclosure, we do not do a lot of ELTF work, but at the same time, we have dealt with assignment of rights. And the statement here on this page has stared at me for the last week or so. The claim costs increased by more than 400% when consultant was a claimant. And I know in our experience, I can tell you in my experience, that's not the case. And I think that's a small minority of consultants have kind of sullied the waters for that statement. So it's, I think it's a broad brush being stroked on the consulting industry, and it's not indicative of 99% of the consultants, probably every consultant in this room as well. So I think it's very important that we, numbers like that, quite frankly, are not indicative of the industry. I think this be said that way, because assignment rights do work in certain instances. Maybe not all. Sorry, I had to pay some lip service to that. I don't talk as much as Jason.
I'm sorry about that. If no one else wants to speak, I would like to ask Chris a question. What do you think would happen with assignment rights? Do you think it's something IFFA would look at seriously or not? Because I kind of feel like Nevis. I mean, we still have a few lingering ones but I do know that we're probably not going to do another one, but that doesn't mean other consultants shouldn't have that ability, depending on who the clients are. I'm not saying we shouldn't, that someone else should do it just because I'm not going to do it. But I guess I'm just wondering how
I think if
the membership would feel about it.
Yeah, I think if IDEM does much what like Brownfield's program does, where they at the front end identify the scope of work, and it may be an ERC at the end of the process. So you're limiting the cost going into it on the front end. That would alleviate some of the pressure when someone has an assignment of rights, right? Because right now, an assignment of rights has a blank check, right? And the tank owner is busy running his business or her business, and they just say, here, you take care of it, consultant. And most consultants out there are doing a fine job. And again, I want to emphasize that. But I think the temptation, and that's what the audit pointed out, there's a conflict of interest is if you're charged with, okay, I can do a clinic for 100,000 or I can do it for 500,000. I've got assignment of rights. I have full liberties to do whatever I want. The tank owner doesn't know any better. You remove that temptation. And it's a temptation. It's an incentive potentially. I think if we can limit the temptation on the front end, I think the assignment of rights might still be able to work. But you need to have some checks and balances in there. And I think by moving the scope of work up front, so IDEM signs off on it, everyone knows what's going to go into it. You get rid of some of the tomfoolery that may have occurred on some of these in the past that gave rise to some of these, very high numbers that Nevis was talking about. Because I've worked with a number of consultants, and they've done a great job with assignment claims. But it's like many other things. It's the handful that taints it for the majority of people who are doing things right.
We can't do anything. This board cannot do anything about that. That's
No,
an agency issue which is why I brought up evidence of fraud and those kind of things. There's nothing we can do about that. If someone is taking advantage of the system, consultant, I think every consultant that's in this room would say, prosecute that person as to the fullest extent of the laws. They're making us look bad.
Yeah, and that's why I say, I think if you put some controls at the front end, some limitations or some checks and balances on the assignment rights and how that will be effectuated, I think it could probably still survive and be a viable option for the small mom and pops and others that you talk about, Nevis and Troy talked about. So it could still be a viable tool, but you've got those checks and balances in there that would help make it more reasonable, more viable.
I would like to think that the movement toward the pre-approved scope of works and the more defined costs
Yes.
in ELTF should mitigate the potential, not fraud, I won't say fraud, but people abusing the fund.
Yeah, and again, I think there's an important distinction between reasonableness and fraud.
Sure.
Fraud is, I'm charging you $100 and I never even did the work. Or I did the work and I charged you $125 and I only reversed paid $100. They disallow 25 because it's not reasonable. It doesn't mean it's fraud. You did the work and spent the time. So there's an important distinction. So just because somebody's got a cost disallowed doesn't mean it's fraudulent. And not every disallowed cost gets referred over for criminal prosecution either. So, but again, I think if we can, that's why I encouraged earlier, I'd like really to see, like we did in the past, have IDEM, the consulting community, the tank owners work on language. So whether it's adopting pre-approval on the scope of work or any number of things, I think we have the potential, the opportunity now with Senate Bill 246 to do some really amazing and be leaders in the country. I'm not talking about just in Indiana, nationally, to be a leader in environmental cleanups, compliant USD compliance, picking up above ground storage tanks, having reopeners. These are really exciting developments. And quite frankly, I think it'll be tremendous work in the environmental consulting community. So, you think about 1,700 tanks to be upgraded. I think I could probably find a few consultants out here that might be interested in doing some of that work. And so, but I think we can have a dialogue and come up, because the bill will become effective July 1, assuming it gets passed by the House, it gets signed into law by the governor. And it becomes effective, and then, until, item comes up with new regulations, it'll stay in effect. So I think there's a great opportunity. We had a discussion earlier with Tom about, the language right now is broadly written to picking up 50% of the cost to decommission and install a new system. That includes, the concrete that you tear up and put down. It includes taking out the pipes, it includes any number of things. And keep in mind, with Elk picking up 50% of the cost, if I'm a station owner, right? And I've got an old 30-year-old tank, and I've got the opportunity to upgrade it, put in a brand new one, and Item's gonna pay 50% of the cost of that. I've now increased the value of my property substantially, right? So even though I've got to come out of, let's say it's $500,000, Item's gonna pick up through Elk 250 of that. I'm gonna put in 250, but I've now substantially increased the value of my asset, that, the bank will be thrilled about, your own balance sheet will be excited about, et cetera. So I think, again, it's got an opportunity to be a win-win, for everybody involved. And so again, I think the assignment of rights by itself is not a bad or evil thing. It's the misuse of it. So if we can put the proper checks and balances in the front end, like you were talking about, pre-approval and some other things, we can still make it a viable tool, but we can't leave it as an unchecked, open checkbook that we have right now.
I think there's a couple folks that want to ask you a question on the back.
Just for clarification, Chris, I mean, you say 50%, but is that $100,000 cap?
No.
So if you spend 500, which is pretty realistic, I thought it had $100,000 cap.
No, it's, and so for the small one at the top, that 1 to 12 tanks, it would be 10 million a year available to pay 50% of the cost. And so we're talking about paying in the full amount, currently Item is paid for tank removal, right? We're now talking about go to those folks, pay for tank removal and decommission it, and then put a new system in, pay over, et cetera, pay 50% of the cost. I mean, it's a huge opportunity.
You're gonna run through that. Break that.
That's right.
My question is, what's the, effect of the fund? I think you're gonna get flooded, it's just gonna be well received, well accepted, and,
And we're hoping that we rather spend money on the front end on a compliance than on the back end on a cleanup. And so, if you had to order stuff today, you guys are better than I do. You're probably 12 to 18 months out getting all the tanks and else you need. So there's gonna be a long lead time. But we want people, and even if you incur the cost now, like we used to do with Speedway. Speedway would max out at $3 million a year on the fund, and they would bankroll it. If we end up having to have an IOU because we max out to $10 million in 1 year, it's the first dollars out in the following year.
I guess then the only thing is figure out what qualifies, because I know Tom wants the fiberglass before 81, and you got your steel fiberglass line tanks. But then maybe we don't talk about it.
Ethanol changes.
There's all these old tanks that you're gonna have people stay in line in the first month. It's already done for the year.
But we're hoping, again, they won't be able to get all the equipment, everything else in.
Yeah.
But we want, July 2nd, I hope word goes out across the land that, there's now a solution that IDM and the consulting community can provide these station owners.
Well, the day it's signed is when you start running a pre-approval process.
Yeah, and we've got work to do. So again, we want to get some clarity around what constitutes decommissioning. We've potentially written it broadly right now. But we may want to have some confirmation, some clarity around what does that actually mean? And we've talked with Doug, and Item is fully supportive of this. Tom would love to see these old tanks out of the ground yesterday, right? Because again, the threat is you're gonna have a catastrophic release down the road, and you're gonna spend $500,000, $1 million or more in cleanup. Let's be proactive and do it in the front end. But we're willing to work with anybody who is interested in terms of, let's come up with language and everyone's comfortable with in terms of what's in, what's out, how this is gonna work. But those are good, those are good problems to have with this legislation. It's exciting, it's like I say, it's first of the nation stuff.
100,000 is already.
But yeah, so there's no $100,000 limit. Yeah. 50% of whatever the cost is, so.
And then we could use all the money.
It's real quick.
Yeah.
Real quick.
I think it's gonna be, be gone too fast.
Thanks, Chris.
Yep, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, all right.
I saw that the language about, was the commissioner that makes a decision about what would be, a candidate for this program. Is there like a committee or any kind of?
Well, I think what you approach Tom, you approach Item about here's the thing. So I already knows you got on file all the things are, what they're comprised of, that sort of thing. So you're gonna want to contact IDEM and say, this is the candidate, this is somebody we think is a good candidate in this program. And have a discussion with them and get the approval. I didn't just be. Well, I mean, hopefully the commissioner, if you got a site that, it's bulletproof, everything's fine, it's 18 years old. That's not the most pressing need. It's ones that we're looking at that are old. But, I've seen a handful of letters already from IDEM. They're saying, I'm really going to encourage you to take these older things out and we're concerned about. I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of those. Those are prime candidates. And if I'm a consultant with this bill, I go out and I knock to the door and say, hey, the cavalry is coming from July 1. If we get it through, if our House Government Committee comes through like we're hoping to next week, and they give us the green light, I mean, quite frankly, I hope you guys are buried in work for the next 3 years, because it's very exciting, and we wouldn't put certain limits there, we don't want to make the fund insolvent. So we're talking about 20 million a year, you go out for several years. But we're trying to provide a creative method to bring a solution to a lot of these folks that otherwise couldn't afford it.
Right. I just don't know if, just fund for sort of type of thing is really in broader investors, or if there's like a prioritization.
For me, I would say get all Gen 1 environment plans going, like that should have happened. And then Owens Corner, thanks for solar ground. Those would be like the highest
Keep
priority.
in mind, stuff that's sitting on your loan, you got the other 50%. And it's not a free lunch. It's still going to be 200, 250, 300,000, but it's not any consequential. So maybe some self-regulation on that.
Let me just jump in here real quick, if you don't mind. I think part of the issue is putting in statute, only so much definitive details on this program. We want to put in the basic framework of the program, where we provide in the front, I think the whole propagation requirement, and at the very least, look at policy. And we work with NI in setting up a lot of these stuff.
So like, that's what I would. Let's see for that, that's just like an idea, that's excellent.
Yeah, resuming the legislation plans, coaching the legislation plans, then we're providing in developing a policy to answer a lot of the issues that they can prioritize, the things that we're talking about. Back to the question about, the $20 million caps. And yes, that will be completed at the same time, we want to complete the overall health fund. Right, so that's why we set aside $40 million.
We keep money, we also at the same time fighting funding for health care support. So there's gonna be a drawdown of this fund.
Airports and everything else.
Yeah, we'll find right now, that $35 million a year surplus. That's the cost of both guidance and balance.
Yeah.
And it's just painful for a lot of people to understand that, but we think, this is now, this is a position to do this program. So this is only a drawdown of, $30, $40 million a year. We're also putting in, it's 40, 45 million a year. And this year, we're going to track to pay out about $9 million.
This will impact, instead this was viable.
Because we don't collectively come up with ways to enhance the program and get more things done. There'll be, physical rates run, great revenues. We saw that a year ago.
So Troy and I had this discussion already. Regardless of whether we do a formal NPD or informal guidance, there will be some sort of guidance put out, and we're gonna, even if it's informal, we're still going to send that out for comment and get discussion, because there are some things that there needs, it's gonna be a little bit of a push me pull you. There are things that we don't necessarily know that we're gonna need help from consultants to do that. There will be some form of something that you can around prioritization and that ball game. Application, how does that work, approval, all of that, so we definitely are.
Yeah, and we went very quick. Yeah. You got to help guys on that.
Folding contractors and equipment providers and.
Oh, yeah.
It's super exciting, yeah.
Another point there is tanks are taking 12 months if you order one right now. So as far as flooding the program, installing a new tank is not just, oh, here, give me money and install it. Right now, I think the last one was 12 months from actually being delivered to a site. The timing is gonna be very tricky on this.
This is almost what I treat like a grant works. You put in the cost, gets approved,
And so you know exactly what you're gonna get before you start.
Right.
And you do the work, you set it, to show that you spent that in each money. You can't get guesswork. You're gonna have to take them, know what 50% are coming, what exactly you're gonna get back. So you don't think you get back 250,000, and you have to say, oh, well, we did cover, it, unless you're only gonna get back 50,000.
Yeah.
It's almost kind of treat like a grant.
Yeah, with a
It's a
voucher,
grant process.
yeah, like a voucher, you're gonna get a voucher that says if you do this and spend this is the voucher, you're gonna redeem it for.
And I agree, it should be a grant, and I want that to go straight with the owner, that they're gonna get forward that grant. So
Right.
they get that money.
That's what it's.
But these are great conversations, great points. That's why, like I say, if we get this through with the health department, brings over to the house next week, and get it signed into law. We want to jump on the truck. So we want to jump on the truck. Not putting pressure on you. Thank you, Jason, appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah.
My name is Bart Mattson. I'm the owner of SCS Environmental of Fort Wayne. We do contracting work for all over the state. I think I'm one of the only contractors here instead of called consultant, but I work for the consultants here. I work for Jason, Troy, Warren. And one of my questions, I guess, today, and I know this is not a FABCOR question, but more so for the agency, is when are we going to get new rates?
Those are in the draft rule. So they're in the draft rule that's at OMB, we did just,
And when will that be published?
that's a question.
As soon as they release.
As soon as they release it.
They put all.
Are we talking 6 months, 6 years? Will we
Yeah, well,
It's been a
6
long
months,
time.
6
Last
years.
time
I
I think.
know it has, and we submitted it to them a while ago, but like I said before, when session comes into town, rules take a back seat, because OMB has to do everything for every bill that comes out.
Okay.
So my hope is that, as soon as the session's over, we're gonna see a floodgate open of things that they have to get out, because they review everything, and the draft rule and the fiscals and all that stuff related to it, and it's for every agency, so.
So
you know,
how do you arrive at that? I mean, how will it come to the prices? How do you come up with the price?
So for the excavation one, we were looking at data from other states, data from the Brown Coast program that doesn't have defined rates, but what they're seeing as they come in the bids to, formulate what is the rate, and also hedging on the fact that we were gonna get comments. So getting something down and having a placeholder for it now and having that discussion during the comment period, for getting that rate reasonably.
So is that a board within IDEM or is that,
So
someone
here's,
bids
the
or
rule
how?
process is this board will adopt those rules, but the rule process is this. The notice comes out, it's published in the Indiana Register, and it's just draft rules. These are the rules that we want comments on.
Okay.
And those comments are on, it's open for everything. We, as an agency, are required to respond to all of those comments and provide that information to the board that is adopting. We have the Environmental Rules Board, and we have this board. This board is very specific to this particular rulemaking. It's the one they do. So the process that will be, they look at the draft rules, and as I have mentioned before, we also have work groups for our rules. We've always had a work group for this particular rule. And it.
Can I be on that rule?
Yeah, everybody can be on, well, not everybody. We don't. And people who are interested, join us. And we've done it to the point where they've been sort of subgroups in some cases, in big rules where we've done agency rules for the ERB. Where it's very specific about something, we can have sort of subgroups that take on a task and bring it to the larger group in more complicated rulemakings. But the work group is a good process to talk through, just like the conversation we just had.
Right.
Talk through those issues, the pros and the cons. I think it's great because of this. I've seen it be bad because of this. And so it informs what changes will occur to the draft rule. That's really just what we put out there so that the people have something to shoot at, basically, and can explain why it sounds good in the abstract, but when you get to the nuts and bolts of it, it doesn't work, and here's why. So people who have knowledge and information about how it works help to form what that rule looks like. So we have to respond to the comments and that becomes a document and it goes to the board. There are two hearings. There's a preliminary adoption hearing and there's a final adoption hearing for the rule. So the rule can change from when the board preliminarily adopts it. And the board oftentimes will say, you know, we want to keep this moving because it takes forever. So we want to keep this moving, but these are the things we want you to work on in between. And so there might be work group meetings related to specific things. So it's a very fluid document, but there's opportunity for people to, just like this, stand up and testify before the board for the preliminary adoption hearing as well as the final adoption hearing. So it's a very open process and it's very much for the people to whom the rule applies. And so it really is a process that we want people to be involved in.
So this fiscal year?
This fiscal year, we'll have it out, we'll have it out at OMB and hopefully published in the register in this fiscal year.
Okay, long overdue.
I need some wood. Yeah, that's what I'm hoping for.
Any other comments? Before we adjourn, should we set the schedule for the next meeting?
What we have a room scheduled for it. We've been doing it,
August? Don't want to do it in June or July. Right? So too many people will be absent in June or July.
can't party for 2 whole months for heaven's sakes, not can you?
What's convenient for your schedule?
You know, to me, it's up to the board. We can shoot for our standard 3 months. Do you have the date, Carla? Yes, I do.
What do you do?
I should have brought my handy thing you gave me. What's the June date?
June 22nd.
June 22nd.
And August 24th.
Second day of summer. So, we could we can do it tentatively, and if it turns out that that date doesn't work.
It's June 22nd and August 24th. Okay.
July 24th. Or did you say July
Do we
24th?
have
No,
do we have a July date too?
July 27th. I have all dates.
Yeah, so if you've got a person, because it's so hard to get these rooms, we actually have to, we do a year in advance to get all the rooms for
July.
just to pick a date.
So 27th of July, did work?
Yeah, we can, I mean, we can set any of that, we can set June or July tentatively, and then if we have conflicts, we can, you know, change that
Shoot the
date.
dates out there.
Let's just shoot for July
July,
27th.
all right, all right.
And,
let's shoot for-
that way we have a date and the room reserved and, we can always change it later. So something to put on the calendar.
Good.
Do we have any questions from the audience online?
There was only one that came. First testimony earlier. Was that, how do you know it's confined to an immediate vicinity if you only do 1 or 2 more? It's not. That was the first.
That's not someone that's bringing for a more robust ISC than a site check. And motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second, Mr. Barry, all in favor? Now, the question will be. Some of us probably don't care.
By that date, might have a difference.